At 8,848 meters above sea level, the air is thin enough to strip away illusion. Dreams do not echo up there, only decisions do. Imagine standing on the highest point on Earth. The world curved beneath your boots, years of effort compressed into a single, breathless moment. For many climbers, that is the image that pulls them back again and again. But Everest has a quieter truth, one that only reveals itself when it is already too late. In 2012, that truth claimed Shriya Shah. Her story is often summarized in headlines: an ambitious climber, a fatal summit push, another name added to Everest's long ledger of loss. But that framing is too simple and too comfortable. What happened to Shriya was not a sudden accident. It was a slow, unfolding convergence of ambition, pressure, warning signs, and human limits playing out in the most unforgiving environment on the planet. This is not a story about recklessness, nor is it about heroism. It is about the narrow space between preparation and overconfidence, about how the mountain does not punish intent, only outcomes, and about how, on Everest, the line between success and survival is often invisible until it is crossed. On K2 Stories, we don't rush these moments, we slow them down. We examine the choices, the silences, and the seconds that mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Shriya Shah-Klorfine's final climb forces an uncomfortable question one every high-altitude climber eventually faces, whether they admit it or not. How much are you willing to trade for the summit? And more importantly, how do you know when the mountain has already decided the price? Shriya Shah-Klorfine did not arrive at Everest by accident. Like many climbers who eventually stand beneath its south face, her journey was shaped by years of steady ambition rather than a single impulsive decision. She was intelligent, driven, and deeply committed to proving to herself as much as to anyone else that she belonged in the rarefied world of high-altitude mountaineering. In the years leading up to 2012, Shriya had built a resume that, on paper, suggested momentum. She trained hard, invested heavily in expeditions, and surrounded herself with the language of summits and progress. Everest, to her, was not a reckless leap. It was the logical next step in a personal narrative of growth. That framing mattered because once Everest becomes a next step, turning back becomes psychologically harder than most climbers expect. Yet even before the expedition began, unease lingered beneath the surface. Experienced climbers who crossed paths with Shriya noticed gaps not in enthusiasm, but in judgment shaped by experience. Everest is not simply taller than other mountains. It is categorically different. The margin for error collapses above 8,000 meters. Problems that would be manageable elsewhere, fatigue, confusion, minor delays become fatal variables. Some raise quiet concerns about preparation and pacing. Others questioned the decision to attempt Everest with limited exposure to prolonged extreme altitude suffering. None of these doubts were dramatic enough to stop the expedition. On Everest, warnings are rarely loud. They arrive as mild discomforts, uneasy conversations, and instincts that are easy to override when momentum is already moving forward. The commercial structure of modern Everest expeditions also played a role. Clients arrive with expectations, financial, emotional, and reputational. Guides operate under pressure to deliver success, even as they balance responsibility for lives in an environment that resists control. Within this system, Shriya was not an anomaly. She was part of a broader pattern, motivated climbers trusting that structure would compensate for what nature would not forgive. As base camp settled into routine, optimism held. Weather windows were studied, oxygen plans were finalized, roles were assigned. The machinery of an Everest expedition does an excellent job of creating the appearance of order. But above the Khumbu icefall, order becomes fragile. And above the South Col, it becomes largely theoretical. By the time summit day approached, doubts had not disappeared, but they had been absorbed, normalized, reframed as nerves. This is how Everest often works. It does not demand belief. It only requires commitment. And once commitment crosses a certain threshold, walking away no longer feels like a decision, it feels like failure. Summit day on Everest begins long before the sun rises. In the darkness above the South Col, climbers prepare in silence. their movements slow and deliberate, as if conserving not just oxygen but resolve. Headlamps flicker to life. Regulators hiss. At this altitude, even simple tasks feel abstract, disconnected from cause and effect. The body is present, but the mind is already compromised. For Shriya Shah-Klorfine, the climb toward the summit unfolded under conditions that were difficult, but not unusual. The weather window was narrow, the cold was sharp. The line of climbers stretched upward, a slow procession moving toward the highest point on Earth. What mattered most on this day was time. How quickly each climber could ascend, and how honestly they could assess their own limits. From the first hours of the push, delays accumulated. Bottlenecks formed at technical sections. Climbers waited, standing still in temperatures that punished inactivity. Oxygen flowed. Strength quietly drained. Above 8,000 meters, time becomes an invisible adversary. Every minute spent waiting is a minute the body cannot afford. Eyewitness accounts later described Shriya struggling early. Her pace slowed. Her movements became mechanical. These were not dramatic collapses, but subtle signs the kind Everest specializes in. At extreme altitude, deterioration rarely announces itself. It blends into determination. Fatigue masquerades as focus. Confusion hides behind persistence. This is where summit fever takes hold. Not as an emotional frenzy, but as a cognitive narrowing. Options disappear. Turning back feels irrational when the summit seems close enough to touch. The mountain exploits this instinct. It does not rush climbers toward the top, it convinces them they are already committed. As the ascent continued, critical decisions were made or avoided. Timing thresholds passed. The internal calculus shifted from safety to sunk cost. Each step upward made descent feel more wasteful, even as risk increased exponentially. For climbers like Shriya, the line between courage and denial blurred. By the time she reached the summit, success had already come at a price. Photos captured the moment. Flags frost, a face etched with exhaustion rather than triumph. The summit of Everest does not reward the body, it barely tolerates it. And every second spent there is borrowed time. The true danger of Everest has never been the climb up. It is what happens when depleted climbers must reverse direction, descending into gravity, fatigue, and failing cognition without the strength they assumed they would still have. For Shriya Shah-Klorfine, the descent began not as a retreat, but as a continuation of effort, and that distinction would matter more than anyone realized. Descent on Everest is where intention gives way to reality. The body, already stripped of reserves, is asked to perform its most complex task while operating at its weakest state. Balance, coordination, judgment each depends on oxygen the brain no longer has. For climbers descending from the summit, the mountain offers no margin for recovery. Only gravity remains reliable. As Shriya Shah-Klorfine began her way down, her condition visibly deteriorated. Other climbers noticed that she was no longer moving with purpose, but with repetition, one step, then another, as if following a remembered sequence rather than making active decisions. This is a classic presentation of severe altitude impairment. The climber appears conscious, but awareness is fragmented. Speech, when it comes, lacks urgency. Danger no longer registers as danger. Somewhere high on the southeast ridge, Shriya sat down. In mountaineering culture, sitting down in the death zone is an emergency signal. It often marks the moment when the body has reached its absolute limit. At that altitude, rest does not restore strength. It accelerates shutdown. Blood pressure drops, core temperature falls. The will to stand dissolves quietly, without panic. Accounts differ on exactly how long she remained there. Time on Everest is notoriously difficult to reconstruct. Clocks freeze, memories distort, and survivors struggle to distinguish minutes from hours. What is clear is that by the time assistance reached her, options were vanishing. Guides and climbers faced an ethical nightmare that Everest has repeated for decades. Helping another climber at extreme altitude means sacrificing one's own chance of survival. There is no strength to spare, no reserve oxygen for generosity. Each person is already negotiating their own descent from the edge of consciousness. Attempts were made, oxygen was adjusted, words were spoken, but persuasion requires cognition on both sides. and Shriya was slipping away. Eventually, she became unresponsive. Her body, no longer capable of movement, remained where it was. Below her, climbers continued downward. Some paused, some looked back, some could not. Everest does not judge those moments. It merely records the outcome. Later efforts to recover Shriya's body were unsuccessful. The terrain was too steep, the risk too high. The mountain claimed her where she fell, as it has claimed so many others quietly without ceremony. In the aftermath, questions surfaced about leadership, about decision-making, about whether the summit should have been attempted at all. But Everest is indifferent to hindsight. By the time analysis begins, the lesson has already been paid for. What remains is not a mystery of what happened, but a discomfort with how predictable it all was. In the days that followed, the mountain returned to its routines. Snow erased footprints. The jet stream resumed its endless migration. New climbers arrived at base camp carrying their own expectations, largely untouched by the loss that had just occurred higher up. Everest does not pause for grief. It absorbs it. Shriya Shah-Klorfine's death quickly became part of a broader conversation, one that resurfaces after nearly every fatal season. Investigations examined timelines, oxygen logistics, and guide decisions. Some pointed to leadership failures. Others emphasized personal responsibility. A few argued that the system had worked exactly as designed, and that the outcome was simply the cost of operating at the extreme edge of human tolerance. What made her case particularly unsettling was how familiar it felt. The pattern was not unique. A climber with strong motivation but limited margin. A summit push that stretched too late into the day. Subtle signs of decline that were noticed, but not acted on decisively. A descent that demanded strength no longer available. Everest history is dense with these repetitions. The variables, change names, nationalities, weather, but the structure remains remarkably consistent. This raises uncomfortable questions about the modern Everest experience. Commercial expeditions have expanded access to the mountain, but access does not equal readiness. High-altitude skill is not linear. Success on lower peaks does not automatically translate to survival above 8,000 meters. Yet the narrative of progression, train, climb, upgrade, creates an illusion of inevitability, as if Everest is earned through persistence alone. Shriya's tragedy sits at the intersection of that illusion and biological reality. The human body does not negotiate. It does not respect ambition, investment, or intent. Above the death zone, physiology becomes the final authority. Once oxygen deprivation reaches a certain threshold, decision-making collapses. Turning back becomes psychologically impossible at the exact moment it becomes physically essential. There is also the moral burden placed on others. Climbers who passed Shriya were not indifferent, they were constrained. Many were themselves near exhaustion, descending with depleted oxygen and impaired cognition. The expectation that heroism should override survival is emotionally compelling but often detached from what is actually possible at altitude. Everest exposes the limits of altruism not as a moral failing, but as a physiological one. Over time, safety reforms have followed tragedies like this. Stricter turnaround times, improved guide accountability, more explicit client screening, and yet, fatalities continue. Not because lessons are unknown, but because applying them requires choosing restraint over completion, and restraint rarely makes headlines. Shriya Shah-Klorfine's name now exists alongside many others on Everest slopes. Not as a symbol of recklessness, nor as a martyr to ambition, but as a reminder that the mountain's deadliest moments are often the quietest ones, unfolding without drama, long before anyone realizes the outcome is already sealed. Everest does not need villains to take lives. It does not require storms, avalanches, or dramatic failures. More often, it waits for small compromises to accumulate an extra hour, a delayed turnaround, a body pushed slightly beyond what it can recover from. By the time danger becomes obvious, choice has already narrowed. Shriya Shah-Klorfine's final climb leaves behind no single mistake that can be neatly isolated and corrected. Instead, it leaves a chain, each link understandable on its own, each decision defensible in the moment, together, irreversible. This is why Everest remains so difficult to truly learn from. Its lessons are not hidden. They are simply uncomfortable. Preparation matters, but so does humility. Experience matters, but so does recognizing when experience is no longer enough. Above all, judgment matters most precisely when judgment is least reliable. The death zone strips away confidence, logic, and self-poise, leaving climbers to rely on rules they must commit to long before they need them. For families, the loss never becomes abstract. The mountain may move on, but grief does not. It remains grounded, far below the summit, where oxygen is plentiful and questions linger without answers that bring comfort. What remains is the knowledge that ambition, when paired with an indifferent environment, carries a cost that cannot be negotiated after the fact. Everest will continue to draw climbers. That will not change. But stories like Shriya's serve a different purpose than inspiration. They are warnings not against dreaming, but against assuming the dream will wait for you to be ready. Because on Everest, reaching the summit is optional. Coming back alive is not. If these stories matter to you, if understanding the thin line between survival and loss matters, this is why K2 Stories exists. Not to glorify the mountain, but to remember what it demands and what it takes.